The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Sentinel, casting long shadows across the compound as Captain Sarah Chin adjusted her gear for the fifth time that morning. The weight of the M24 sniper rifle felt familiar against her shoulder, like an old friend she hadn't seen in months. Around her, the buzz of military activity filled the air, soldiers checking equipment, vehicles rumbling to life, and the constant chatter of radio communications that formed the soundtrack of war. Sarah had been deployed to this godforsaken corner of Afghanistan for 3 months now, but this would be her first real combat mission since arriving. She had spent weeks training with her new unit, proving herself over and over again to men who looked at her with skepticism written across their weathered faces. At 28, she was one of the youngest snipers in the battalion, and certainly the only woman. The combination made her a curiosity at best, a liability at worst, in the eyes of many of her colleagues. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez approached her position near the armored vehicles, his expression serious as always. He had been her spotter during training exercises, and, despite his initial reservations about working with a female sniper, he had come to respect her skills. The man had seen enough combat to know that accuracy mattered more than gender when bullets started flying. "Intel says we're looking at a compound about 2 clicks northeast of the village," Rodriguez said, spreading a satellite photo across the hood of the nearest Humvee. "Suspected Taliban weapons cache. Command wants eyes on target before the ground team moves in." Sarah studied the image carefully, her trained eye picking out potential shooting positions and escape routes. The compound sat on a small hill overlooking the village, surrounded by low walls that would provide cover for defenders. Several buildings clustered together in the center, with what appeared to be watchtowers on opposite corners. It was a textbook defensive position, and whoever had chosen it knew what they were doing. "What's our insertion point?" she asked, tracing a finger along the terrain features visible in the photo. "There's a ridgeline about 800 meters south of the target. Good overwatch position, multiple egress routes if things go sideways." Rodriguez pointed to a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide excellent concealment. "We'll insert with the patrol, then break off and establish our position while they set up the perimeter." The mission briefing took place in the command tent an hour later. Colonel James Mitchell, the battalion commander, stood before a group of 20 soldiers, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led troops through multiple deployments. Sarah noticed how his eyes lingered on her for just a moment longer than the others, and she wondered if he was having second thoughts about including her in the operation. "This is a high-value target, people," Mitchell began, his pointer tapping against a large map mounted on an easel. "Intelligence indicates this compound is being used as a major weapons storage and distribution point for insurgent activities in this sector. We've been tracking movement in and out for weeks, and today we're going to shut it down." He outlined the plan with military precision. 2 squads would approach from the east and west, establishing a perimeter around the compound while a 3rd squad prepared for direct assault. Sarah and Rodriguez would provide overwatch from the southern ridge, with orders to eliminate any targets that posed a threat to the advancing troops. "Rules of engagement are clear," Mitchell continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled soldiers. "Positive identification required before engaging. We want prisoners if possible, but protecting our people is the priority." "Any questions?" A young private near the back raised his hand. "Sir, what about civilians? Intel shows families living in the village nearby." "Good question, Thompson. That's why we're going in during the day when most civilians should be visible and away from the target area. But stay sharp, insurgents have been known to use human shields." Mitchell's expression darkened. "Chen, Rodriguez, your job is to keep watch for any movement that might threaten the assault team. Your position should give you the best view of the entire area." After the briefing, Sarah spent time checking and rechecking her equipment. The M24 was a precision instrument, and she treated it with the respect it deserved. Each component was cleaned and inspected: the Schmidt and Bender scope, the match-grade ammunition, the Harris bipod that would steady her shots. Her ghillie suit hung nearby, the carefully crafted camouflage that would make her nearly invisible once she reached her position. Rodriguez found her in the armory as she finished her preparations. "You ready for this?" he asked, settling down beside her workbench. Sarah looked up from the rifle she was cleaning. I've been ready since the day I qualified for sniper school. The question is whether everyone else is ready to accept that I belong here. Some of the guys are still getting used to the idea, Rodriguez admitted. But your scores speak for themselves. Best shooter in the battalion, male or female. It was true. During qualification, Sarah had consistently outperformed every other sniper in the unit. Her record included confirmed hits at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, and her ability to remain calm under pressure had impressed even the most skeptical instructors. But she knew that training scenarios were different from real combat, where the target shot back and lives hung in the balance. The convoy departed at 0400 hours, 6 vehicles carrying the assault teams toward their objective. Sarah rode in the third Humvee, her rifle secured in a padded case beside her. The landscape outside was a moonlit expanse of desert and rocky hills, broken occasionally by the dark silhouettes of villages. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the blazing heat that would come with sunrise. Rodriguez sat across from her, studying a handheld GPS unit and making notes on a waterproof pad. ETA to insertion point is 45 minutes, he said quietly. Winds out of the southwest at about 8 knots, temperatures dropping but should warm up fast once the sun comes up. Sarah nodded, making mental calculations about how environmental conditions would affect her shots. Wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, even barometric pressure could influence a bullet's trajectory over long distances. A skilled sniper learned to read nature like a book, using every available piece of information to ensure accuracy. The insertion went smoothly. As planned, Sarah and Rodriguez separated from the main convoy about a kilometer from the target area, making their way on foot toward the southern ridge. The terrain was rough but navigable, covered with loose rocks and sparse vegetation that provided natural camouflage. They moved carefully, using established techniques to minimize noise and avoid detection. Reaching their position just as the sky began to lighten in the east, Sarah quickly set up her shooting position. The location was perfect, a natural depression in the rocks that provided cover while offering an unobstructed view of the target compound. She deployed her bipod and adjusted the scope, scanning the area through the powerful optics. The compound looked exactly like the satellite photos, but seeing it in person added details that images couldn't capture. Smoke rose from cooking fires within the walls, indicating people were awake and active. Several figures moved between buildings, too distant to identify clearly but obviously going about morning routines. Through her scope, Sarah could see that at least some of them appeared to be armed. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch, Rodriguez spoke quietly into his radio. We're in position and have eyes on target. Count approximately 6 to 8 individuals visible, at least 3 appear to be carrying weapons. The response crackled back immediately. Copy, Overwatch. Alpha Team is 5 minutes out. Bravo Team moving to western approach. Stand by. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly as the moment of truth approached. This was it, her first real combat engagement as a sniper. Everything she had trained for, every hour spent on the range perfecting her skills, had led to this point. She controlled her breathing, settling into the familiar rhythm that would keep her shots accurate when the time came. Through her scope, she watched the compound with professional intensity. A man emerged from one of the buildings, carrying what appeared to be an AK-47. He walked casually to the nearest watchtower and began climbing the wooden ladder. Another figure appeared near the main gate, also armed, scanning the surrounding terrain as if looking for threats. Movement in the north tower, Sarah reported quietly. One individual, armed with assault rifle. Second target at main entrance, also armed. Copy that, Overwatch. Alpha Team is moving into position now. The waiting was always the hardest part. Sarah had learned this during her training, the long minutes or hours when everything was ready but nothing was happening. It was during these times that doubt could creep in, when the mind had too much opportunity to consider all the things that could go wrong. She pushed such thoughts aside, focusing instead on her breathing and the steady crosshairs visible through her scope. The compound remained relatively quiet as the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the buildings and walls. Sarah counted at least 8 individuals now, moving in and out of various structures. Some appeared to be civilians, women and children who were probably family members of the insurgents. Others were clearly combatants, carrying weapons and moving with the alertness of people expecting trouble. Alpha leader to Overwatch, the radio crackled. We have movement on the eastern perimeter. Unknown number of individuals approaching your sector. Can you confirm? Sarah swung her scope toward the east, scanning the approaches to the compound. There, movement among the rocks about 300 meters from the target. She counted at least 4 figures, all carrying weapons and moving in tactical formation toward the compound's rear entrance. Overwatch confirms 4 individuals approaching eastern perimeter, she reported. All appear armed, moving in tactical formation. Looks like they're trying to reinforce the compound. The situation was becoming more complex by the minute. What had started as a simple raid on a suspected weapons cache was evolving into something larger. If insurgents were moving to reinforce the compound, it suggested they knew about the approaching American forces. Either they had lookouts posted, or someone had tipped them off. All units, be advised we may have compromised operational security, Colonel Mitchell's voice came through the radio. Unknown how much the enemy knows about our presence. Alpha and Bravo teams, proceed with caution. Sarah watched through her scope as the 4 reinforcements reached the compound and were quickly let inside through a rear gate. The defenders now numbered at least a dozen, possibly more hidden inside the buildings. The odds were still in favor of the American forces, but the element of surprise had clearly been lost. Overwatch, this is Alpha Leader. We're beginning our approach. Need you to keep eyes on those towers and report any movement. Copy, Alpha Leader. Both towers under observation. The assault began slowly, almost anticlimactically. Alpha team moved in carefully from the east, using every bit of available cover as they approached the compound's main entrance. Sarah watched through her scope as they advanced, feeling helpless at her distance from the action. Her job was to observe and engage targets of opportunity, but so far everyone inside the compound remained hidden behind walls and buildings. Then, everything changed in an instant. The first shot came from the north tower, a sharp crack that echoed across the desert. Sarah saw the muzzle flash through her scope and immediately began tracking the shooter. Through her crosshairs, she could see a bearded man in traditional Afghan clothing, firing an AK-47 at the approaching American soldiers. Taking fire from North Tower, Alpha Leader's voice was urgent now. Request immediate suppression. Sarah didn't need to be asked twice. She had already settled into her shooting position, crosshairs centered on the gunman's chest. The range was approximately 600 meters, well within her capabilities, but requiring careful attention to wind and elevation. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and began applying pressure to the trigger. The M24 bucked against her shoulder as the match-grade bullet left the barrel at over 2,000 feet per second. Through her scope, Sarah saw the insurgents suddenly jerk backward and disappear from view. Her first shot in combat had found its mark. Target down in North Tower, she reported, already scanning for additional threats. More shots erupted from various points around the compound as defenders opened fire on the approaching American forces. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from windows and doorways, but most of the shooters remained concealed behind walls and other cover. She needed clear shots to be effective, and the insurgents were being smart about their positioning. Overwatch, we have movement on the roof of the main building, Rodriguez called out, pointing toward the compound's central structure. Sarah swung her rifle toward the building and immediately saw what he meant. 2 figures had appeared on the rooftop, both carrying what looked like rocket-propelled grenades. If they managed to get those weapons into action, the American assault teams would be in serious danger. 2 individuals on main building roof, armed with RPGs, she reported while tracking the nearest target. Engage immediately, came the urgent response. Do not let them fire those weapons. The range was longer now, nearly 800 meters, and the targets were moving. Sarah had to lead her shot, aiming slightly ahead of where the man was going rather than where he was. She controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger. Her second shot took the RPG gunner in the torso, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the rooftop. The second man, seeing his companion fall, immediately dropped to a prone position and began crawling toward cover. Sarah worked the bolt action smoothly, chambering a fresh round while tracking the second target. He was moving more carefully now, obviously aware that he was being targeted by a sniper. She had to wait for him to expose himself enough to present a clear shot. The opportunity came when he reached the edge of the roof and rose slightly to peer over the low wall surrounding the rooftop. It was only a partial target, head and shoulders, but Sarah had trained for such shots. She centered her crosshairs and fired. Both RPG operators down, she reported, scanning for new targets. The firefight continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah providing precision fire support from her overwatch position. She engaged targets in windows, on rooftops, and moving between buildings, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed. Her accuracy was devastating. Every time an insurgent exposed himself to fire at the American forces, Sarah's rifle spoke and another threat was eliminated. By the time the shooting stopped, she had fired 18 rounds and scored 16 confirmed hits. The compound had been secured with minimal American casualties, and a significant cache of weapons and ammunition was discovered inside the buildings. Intelligence materials found at the site would provide valuable information about insurgent activities in the region. As the teams prepared to withdraw, Colonel Mitchell approached Sarah's position personally. She had just finished cleaning her rifle and packing her equipment when she noticed the senior officer climbing the rocky slope toward her hide site. "Outstanding work today, Chen," Mitchell said, slightly out of breath from the climb. "Your shooting made the difference out there. Alpha Leader estimates you prevented at least 3 American casualties with your suppression of those RPG positions." Sarah felt a surge of pride at the recognition, but she kept her expression professional. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." Mitchell studied her for a moment, and she could see a new respect in his eyes. "That was some of the finest precision shooting I've witnessed in 20 years of service. Word's going to get around about today." As they prepared to return to base, Rodriguez clapped her on the shoulder. "Not bad for your first time under fire," he said with a grin. "Think you can handle being the battalion's go-to sniper?" Sarah shouldered her rifle and looked back at the compound where she had proven herself in combat. The doubt and skepticism she had faced since arriving were gone now, replaced by the quiet confidence that came from performing under pressure. She had taken her first shots in combat and demonstrated that gender meant nothing when lives were on the line. "I think I can handle whatever comes next," she replied, already knowing that this was just the beginning of her story. 3 weeks after the compound raid, Sarah Chen had become something of a legend at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Word of her performance had spread quickly through the battalion, and then beyond, reaching other units and even rear echelon personnel who typically had little interest in frontline combat operations. The story grew with each telling: 16 confirmed kills in her first engagement, precision shots that saved American lives, a calm professionalism under fire that impressed even veteran soldiers. But with recognition came new challenges. Sarah found herself assigned to increasingly dangerous missions, often specifically requested by unit commanders who had heard about her capabilities. The psychological weight of taking lives, even enemy combatants who posed clear threats to her fellow soldiers, began to accumulate. She started having trouble sleeping, plagued by dreams where the faces of the men she had killed appeared with startling clarity. Captain David Walsh, the battalion's psychological operations officer, noticed the signs during a routine debriefing session. Sarah had just returned from her 4th mission in 2 weeks, another successful operation where her sniper skills had provided crucial support to ground forces. But Walsh saw something in her eyes that concerned him, a distance, a withdrawal that he recognized from other soldiers who had seen too much combat too quickly. "How are you handling the operational tempo?" Walsh asked during their private session in his small office near the medical facility. Sarah considered the question carefully. She had learned to be honest with herself about her mental state, understanding that self-deception could be dangerous in combat situations. "It's intense," she admitted. "But I'm managing. The missions are going well." "That's not what I asked," Walsh replied gently. "I'm not questioning your performance, everyone knows you're exceptional at what you do. I'm asking how you're doing personally." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Sarah talked about the dreams, the way she sometimes found herself calculating distances and wind patterns even when she was supposed to be relaxing, the growing isolation she felt from soldiers who looked at her with a mixture of admiration and unease. Walsh listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights from his experience counseling other combat veterans. "It's normal to feel this way," he told her. "You've been thrust into a role that carries enormous responsibility, and you're performing under scrutiny that most soldiers never face. Add in the fact that you're breaking new ground as a female sniper in a male-dominated environment, and the psychological pressure becomes even more intense." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking on Walsh's office door. Sergeant Major Patricia Williams, the battalion's senior non-commissioned officer, entered with obvious concern on her weathered face. "Captain Chen, you need to gear up immediately," Williams said. "We have a situation developing about 20 kilometers northwest of here. Convoy under attack, multiple casualties reported, and they're requesting immediate sniper support." Sarah was on her feet before Williams finished speaking, her mind already shifting into combat mode. Personal concerns and psychological analysis could wait, soldiers were in danger, and she had the skills to help them. Within minutes, she was back at her equipment locker, checking her rifle and gathering her gear. Rodriguez joined her as she prepared, his expression grim as he studied the mission briefing they had just received. "This one's different," he warned. "Intelligence suggests we're dealing with a more sophisticated enemy force. Professional training, possibly foreign advisors. They've set up what looks like a coordinated ambush using the terrain to their advantage." The briefing materials painted a troubling picture. A supply convoy consisting of 4 vehicles had been traveling the main highway when they were hit by a complex ambush. The attackers had used improvised explosive devices to disable the lead and rear vehicles, trapping the convoy in a kill zone. Automatic weapons fire from multiple positions kept the American soldiers pinned down while the insurgents maneuvered to finish them off. Helicopter support was limited due to mechanical problems with 2 of the base's 3 aircraft, and ground reinforcements would take at least an hour to reach the scene. The convoy's radio operator had specifically requested sniper support, reporting that the attackers were using elevated positions that would be perfect targets for precision rifle fire. Colonel Mitchell personally briefed Sarah before her departure. "This is a race against time," he explained, pointing to aerial photographs of the ambush site. "Our people are trapped in open terrain with limited cover. The longer they stay pinned down, the more likely the enemy will find a way to finish them off." The insertion was the most dangerous Sarah had yet attempted. Instead of approaching cautiously on foot, she and Rodriguez were inserted by helicopter directly onto a hilltop overlooking the ambush site. The aircraft barely touched down before they jumped out and took cover as it immediately departed, not wanting to linger in an area where enemy forces might have anti-aircraft weapons. From their elevated position, Sarah could see the convoy clearly through her scope. 3 vehicles sat motionless on the highway, with the 4th burning fiercely about 50 meters ahead of the others. Bodies lay scattered around the vehicles, some moving, others ominously still. Smoke from various small fires drifted across the scene, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the firefight continued. "Count at least 12 enemy positions," Rodriguez reported as he surveyed the battlefield through his spotting scope. "They've got our people in a perfect crossfire. Range to nearest target is approximately 400 meters." Sarah began systematically identifying priority targets. The insurgents had positioned themselves expertly, using rocky outcroppings and a dried riverbed to create overlapping fields of fire that covered the entire length of the convoy. Several of them appeared to be armed with machine guns, laying down continuous fire that prevented the American soldiers from moving to better defensive positions. Her first target was obvious, a machine gun team positioned on a small hill about 500 meters from the convoy. Through her scope, she could see 2 men working the weapon, one feeding ammunition while the other directed fire at the trapped Americans. They were so focused on their targets that they had no idea death was approaching from 800 meters away. Sarah's shot took the gunner cleanly, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber a fresh round while tracking the assistant. The second man, confused by his partner's sudden collapse, raised his head to look around just as Sarah's crosshairs settled on him. Her follow-up shot arrived a second later. Machine gun position neutralized, she reported while scanning for her next target. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. With the heavy machine guns silenced, American soldiers near the convoy began moving to better positions, using the brief respite to improve their defensive situation. But Sarah knew the advantage would be temporary. The remaining insurgents would quickly adapt to the threat she represented. Her next target was more challenging. An insurgent with what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade had positioned himself in the dried riverbed, using the natural terrain for cover while preparing to engage the convoy. Only his upper torso was visible above the bank, and he was constantly moving as he prepared his weapon. Sarah had to wait for the right moment, tracking the target through her scope while controlling her breathing and heart rate. When the man finally paused to aim his weapon at one of the disabled vehicles, she had the clear shot she needed. The bullet struck him center mass, and the RPG fell harmlessly into the riverbed. The firefight continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah methodically eliminating enemy positions while American forces on the ground began to gain the upper hand. Her shooting was precise and devastating. Every round she fired found its intended target, and the psychological effect on the surviving insurgents was obvious. Men who had been firing confidently from covered positions began to withdraw, unwilling to risk exposure to the deadly accurate sniper fire. "Outstanding work, Overwatch," came the voice of the convoy commander over the radio. "Your fire support has turned this whole situation around. We're beginning to consolidate our position now." But Sarah's most challenging shot was still ahead of her. Through her scope, she had identified what appeared to be the enemy commander, a man in traditional Afghan dress who was moving between positions and directing the remaining fighters. He was smart about his movement, never exposing himself for more than a few seconds at a time, and always using available cover to mask his position. The range was nearly 900 meters, and the target was only briefly visible between rocky outcroppings. Sarah would have one chance, maybe two at most, before the man disappeared entirely or moved beyond her effective range. She settled into her shooting position and began tracking his movement pattern, trying to predict where he would appear next. When the opportunity came, everything had to be perfect. Wind speed, temperature, ammunition temperature, even the slight tremor in her hands from adrenaline, every variable had to be accounted for in the split second she had to make the shot. Sarah saw the target emerge from behind a large boulder and immediately begin her shooting sequence. Breath control. Natural respiratory pause. Crosshairs steady on target. Smooth trigger press. The bullet's flight time at that range was over a second, long enough for doubt to creep into any shooter's mind. But Sarah had learned to trust her training and her equipment. She watched through her scope as the target suddenly pitched forward and disappeared from view. "Command target down," she reported. "Enemy appears to be withdrawing from all positions." The battle was effectively over. Without their leader and having suffered heavy casualties from Sarah's precision fire, the remaining insurgents began a general withdrawal. American forces from the convoy were finally able to move freely, tending to wounded and securing the area while awaiting reinforcements. The casualty report, when it came, was sobering. 4 American soldiers had been killed in the initial ambush, with 6 more wounded. But Sarah's intervention had prevented what could have been a complete disaster. Intelligence officers who later examined the site estimated that without sniper support, the entire convoy would likely have been overrun. Colonel Mitchell was waiting for Sarah when her helicopter returned to base. His expression was serious as he approached her across the landing pad, and she wondered if something had gone wrong with the mission she wasn't aware of. "Chen, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "In private." His office was crowded with maps, reports, and other materials related to ongoing operations throughout the region. Mitchell gestured for Sarah to take a seat before settling behind his desk and studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," he began. "Word about your capabilities has reached some very high levels. People in positions where they make decisions about how we conduct operations in this theater." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. Attention from senior leadership could be either very good or very bad, and she had no way to know which direction this conversation was heading. "You've been personally requested for an operation that's being planned at division level," Mitchell continued. "High risk, high-reward mission that could significantly impact the security situation in this entire province. The details, as Mitchell outlined them, were both exciting and terrifying. Intelligence had identified a meeting scheduled to take place between several high-level Taliban commanders and what appeared to be foreign advisors, possibly Pakistani ISI agents. The meeting was to occur in a remote mountain village about 60 kilometers from their current location, in terrain that would be perfect for sniper operations. The mission is voluntary, Mitchell emphasized. You've already done more than your share, and no one would question your decision if you chose to pass on this one. But the intelligence people specifically asked for you after hearing about your performance today. Sarah considered the offer carefully. She understood the implications. A successful mission could deal a significant blow to enemy operations in the region, potentially saving many American and Afghan lives. But failure could mean not just her own death, but the loss of crucial intelligence and a significant propaganda victory for the insurgents. What's the timeline? She asked. 72 hours to plan and prepare. Insertion would be by helicopter at night, extraction the same way assuming everything goes according to plan. And if it doesn't go according to plan? Mitchell's expression grew even more serious. Then, you and your spotter would be on your own in some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan, probably 60 kilometers from the nearest friendly forces. That evening, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the base, thinking about the decision she faced. The mission represented everything she had trained for, the ultimate test of her skills as a sniper and her ability to operate independently in hostile territory. But it also represented risks that went far beyond anything she had faced so far. Rodriguez found her near the base's eastern watchtower, staring out at the mountains that dominated the horizon. Heard about the offer, he said simply. Hell of a thing to consider. What would you do? Sarah asked. Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, obviously thinking carefully about his answer. 3 months ago, I would have said you were crazy to even consider it, he finally replied. But I've seen what you can do under fire now. If anyone can pull off something like this, it's you. That's not really an answer. Yes, it is, Rodriguez said. You're not the same person who arrived here 3 months ago. You've proven yourself in ways that most soldiers never get the chance to. The question now is whether you're ready to take on the kind of mission that could define your entire career. Sarah spent most of the night thinking about Rodriguez's words. She had indeed changed since arriving at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The uncertain, somewhat defensive soldier who had worked so hard to prove herself had evolved into someone more confident and capable. Her skills had been tested in combat and found to be exceptional. But, more importantly, she had learned to trust herself and her abilities under the most stressful conditions imaginable. When she reported to Colonel Mitchell's office the next morning, her decision was clear. I'll take the mission, sir, she said simply. Mitchell nodded, though she could see concern in his expression. I hoped you would, but I also hoped you'd think carefully before deciding. This is going to be unlike anything you've done so far. I understand the risks, sir. But I also understand what success could mean for our operations here. The planning phase began immediately. Intelligence officers briefed Sarah and Rodriguez on every detail available about the target area, the expected participants in the meeting, and the tactical situation they would face. Maps, satellite photos, and intercepted communications painted a picture of a complex operation that would require perfect execution. Their insertion point would be a mountain ridge about 3 kilometers from the target village. The approach would require a night movement through difficult terrain, followed by the establishment of a hide site that could provide observation of the meeting location while remaining undetected by local security forces. The meeting is scheduled to begin at 1400 hours local time, the intelligence officer explained. We expect it to last no more than 2 hours, giving you a relatively narrow window for engagement. Weather forecast shows clear skies, which is good for shooting conditions but bad for concealment. Sarah studied the photos carefully, already beginning to plan her shooting positions and escape routes. The village sat in a valley surrounded by steep mountains, with only 2 roads leading in or out. If her position was compromised, she and Rodriguez would have limited options for withdrawal. Rules of engagement, she asked. Weapons free on confirmed targets, came the reply. But positive identification is critical. We cannot afford mistakes that might hit civilians or compromise the intelligence value of this operation. As Sarah prepared for what would be the most challenging mission of her career, she reflected on how much her life had changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The young woman who had struggled to gain acceptance from her male colleagues had evolved into one of the most effective snipers in the theater. But she knew that tomorrow's mission would test her in ways she had never been tested before. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure was not an option. The helicopter lifted off from Forward Operating Base Sentinel at 2,300 hours, its rotors cutting through the crisp mountain air as it carried Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez toward what would become the most significant mission of both their careers. The aircraft flew low and fast, following valleys and terrain features to avoid detection by enemy forces that might have early warning capabilities in the mountainous region. Sarah sat in the back of the Black Hawk, her M24 rifle secured between her knees while she mentally reviewed every detail of the mission plan. Beside her, Rodriguez checked their navigation equipment and communication gear one final time. Both soldiers wore full combat gear optimized for mountain operations, cold weather clothing, climbing equipment, and enough food and water to sustain them for 3 days if extraction became impossible. The pilot's voice crackled through their headphones. 15 minutes to insertion point. Weather remains clear, no visible ground activity in the target area. Through the helicopter's small windows, Sarah could see the rugged landscape passing below, jagged peaks and deep valleys that had been the graveyard of armies throughout history. Alexander the Great had struggled in these mountains, as had the British Empire and the Soviet Union. Now American forces were learning the same lessons about fighting in terrain that favored defenders who knew every ridge and valley. The insertion point was a small plateau about 3 kilometers from their target village, chosen because it offered the helicopter a relatively safe landing zone while keeping Sarah and Rodriguez far enough away to avoid detection by local security forces. Intelligence indicated that the meeting they were supposed to observe would take place in a compound on the village's eastern edge, positioned to overlook a valley that served as a major smuggling route. 2 minutes out, the pilot announced. Be advised, we're picking up some radio chatter from the target area. Nothing specific, but there's definitely activity down there. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that always preceded dangerous operations. This mission was different from her previous engagements. Instead of providing support to ground forces in direct combat, she would be operating independently in hostile territory with minimal backup available. Success or failure would depend entirely on her skills and preparation. The helicopter flared hard as it approached the landing zone, its rotors stirring up clouds of dust and loose vegetation. Sarah and Rodriguez were out the door before the aircraft had fully touched down, running toward the tree line while the pilot immediately lifted off and disappeared into the night sky. The sudden silence after the helicopter's departure was almost overwhelming. Rodriguez immediately began checking their position with a handheld GPS unit while Sarah scanned the surrounding area through her night vision goggles. The plateau was exactly as described in their briefings, a relatively flat area surrounded by rocky outcroppings and stunted trees that would provide cover for their movement toward the target area. Position confirmed, Rodriguez whispered. Target bearing is 047 degrees, distance approximately 3.2 kilometers. The approach took over 3 hours, moving carefully through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and make noise. Every step had to be planned and executed with precision to avoid alerting any security forces that might be patrolling the area. They followed ridgelines when possible, staying below the skyline to avoid creating silhouettes that could be spotted from the valley below. Sarah had trained extensively for this type of movement, but the reality of carrying full combat equipment through mountain terrain at night while maintaining operational security was exhausting. Her respect for the local fighters who had been operating in these mountains for decades grew with every difficult kilometer they covered. At 0400 hours, they reached their planned observation position, a rocky outcropping that provided excellent concealment while offering clear lines of sight to the target village. Sarah immediately began setting up her shooting position while Rodriguez established their communication post and began surveying the area with his spotting scope. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see the village clearly even in the pre-dawn darkness. It was larger than she had expected, with perhaps 50 buildings scattered along the valley floor and climbing the surrounding hillsides. The compound where the meeting was supposed to take place sat prominently on the eastern edge, a traditional Afghan structure with high walls and several buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Overwatch in position, Rodriguez reported quietly into their radio. Good visibility of target area, no immediate threats observed. The response from their controller back at base came immediately. Copy, Overwatch. Satellite intelligence confirms meeting is still scheduled for 1,400 hours. Participants began arriving at the village approximately 2 hours ago. As dawn approached, Sarah could see the village coming to life. Smoke began rising from cooking fires, and people started moving between buildings as they went about their morning routines. Through her scope, she watched women tending to children and men leading animals out to pasture. It was a reminder that despite the military significance of their mission, this was also a community where families lived their daily lives. The morning passed slowly as Sarah and Rodriguez maintained their surveillance of the target area. They took turns observing while the other rested, maintaining a constant watch for any developments that might affect their mission. Intelligence updates from their base came regularly, confirming that high-value targets were indeed present in the village and that the meeting remained on schedule. At 1,200 hours, Rodriguez spotted the first clear indication that something significant was about to happen. Movement at the compound, he reported. Multiple vehicles arriving, looks like some kind of security detail. Through her scope, Sarah watched as 3 vehicles approached the compound and stopped outside its main gate. Armed men got out of each vehicle, obviously providing security for whoever was inside. The men carried modern weapons and moved with the discipline of trained fighters rather than local militia. Count at least 12 security personnel, she reported. Professional appearance, good equipment. These aren't local farmers with rifles. Over the next hour, additional vehicles arrived carrying what were obviously the meeting participants. Sarah counted at least 20 people entering the compound, including several who appeared to be foreigners based on their clothing and behavior. Intelligence had been correct, this was clearly a significant gathering of enemy leadership. At exactly 1,400 hours, the meeting began. Through her scope, Sarah could see figures moving onto a covered porch area of the compound's main building. The distance was approximately 800 meters, well within her effective range, but requiring precise shooting given the importance of the targets. Positive identification on target Alpha, Rodriguez announced, studying the group through his spotting scope and comparing faces to photographs they had been provided. Taliban commander confirmed present and visible. Sarah adjusted her scope and immediately located the man Rodriguez had identified. Through her crosshairs, she could see a bearded man in traditional dress who matched the intelligence photos they had studied during mission planning. He was standing near the center of the group, obviously in a position of authority. Target Alpha acquired, she confirmed. Clear shot available. But, before she could fire, Rodriguez grabbed her shoulder. Hold fire. Movement from the north, looks like additional security forces. Sarah reluctantly moved her rifle away from the target to scan the northern approaches to the village. What she saw made her heart sink. A convoy of vehicles was approaching along the main road, carrying what appeared to be at least 30 additional fighters. If those reinforcements reached the compound, the tactical situation would become much more complicated. Advise higher headquarters, she told Rodriguez. We may have a narrow window before this gets a lot more difficult. The radio exchange with their controller was brief but tense. Overwatch, you are cleared to engage primary targets. Recommend immediate action before additional hostiles arrive on scene. Sarah returned her attention to the compound, quickly reacquiring target Alpha through her scope. The man was still visible on the porch, engaged in animated conversation with several other individuals. The range was perfect, wind conditions were favorable, and she had a clear shot. Everything she had trained for over the past year came down to this moment. She controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and began applying pressure to the trigger. The shot felt perfect as it left the rifle, smooth trigger press, natural follow-through, crosshairs steady on target. Through her scope, she saw target Alpha suddenly collapse as the bullet struck him center mass. Target Alpha down, she reported while working the bolt action to chamber a fresh round. The effect on the gathering was immediate chaos. People scattered in all directions, some running for cover inside buildings while others rushed toward vehicles parked near the compound's entrance. But Sarah's mission was to eliminate as many high-value targets as possible, not just the primary objective. Target Bravo, bearded male in gray jacket, northwest corner of porch, Rodriguez called out, identifying the second priority target. Sarah had already spotted the man and was tracking him as he moved toward the building's entrance. The shot was more difficult, a moving target at long range, but she had trained extensively for such scenarios. She led the target slightly, accounting for his movement and the bullet's flight time, then fired. Her second shot took target Bravo in the back as he reached for the door handle. He pitched forward and lay still, obviously dead before he hit the ground. The remaining people at the compound were now in full panic, abandoning any semblance of organization as they fled the deadly accurate sniper fire. Sarah continued engaging targets methodically, taking careful aim at anyone who appeared to be in a leadership position or carrying weapons. But the approaching reinforcements had seen the chaos at the compound and were responding aggressively. Instead of continuing toward the village, the convoy stopped about a kilometer away and began deploying troops to search for the source of the sniper fire. "We have a problem," Rodriguez announced grimly. "Those reinforcements are setting up a search pattern. They know generally where the shots are coming from." Sarah had fired 7 rounds and scored 6 confirmed hits, eliminating what intelligence would later confirm were some of the most important Taliban commanders in the region. But her position was becoming untenable as enemy forces began systematically searching the high ground around the village. "Time to go," she decided, beginning to pack up her equipment. "Call for extraction." The radio call to their base brought unwelcome news. "Overwatch, extraction helicopter is experiencing mechanical difficulties. Estimated delay 2 hours minimum. Can you maintain your position?" Looking down at the valley where dozens of armed fighters were beginning to spread out and search for their position, Sarah knew that remaining in place for 2 more hours would be suicidal. They needed to move immediately, and they needed to find a defensive position where they could hold out until help arrived. "Negative on maintaining position," Rodriguez replied. "We are compromising immediately and moving to alternate extraction point." The alternate extraction point was another plateau about 5 kilometers to the west, chosen during mission planning as a backup in case their primary location became unsuitable. Reaching it would require moving across open terrain while being hunted by an enemy that knew the local geography far better than they did. Sarah slung her rifle and shouldered her pack, taking one last look at the compound where she had just eliminated half a dozen high-value targets. Smoke was rising from several buildings now, probably set on fire during the panic that followed her shots. The mission had been a tactical success, but their survival was far from guaranteed. The withdrawal began immediately, with Rodriguez leading the way along a route they had planned during their approach the previous night. They moved as quickly as possible while still maintaining noise discipline, knowing that speed was now more important than stealth but unable to completely abandon tactical considerations. After an hour of hard movement through the mountains, they reached a position where they could observe their back trail. What Sarah saw through her scope was deeply troubling. At least 50 fighters were following their route, moving in organized groups that suggested military training rather than the random pursuit she had hoped to see. "They're good," she told Rodriguez. "Professional trackers, probably following our footprints and disturbed vegetation. We're not going to outrun them." Rodriguez studied the terrain ahead of them, looking for defensive positions where they might be able to hold off pursuers until extraction arrived. The landscape offered several possibilities: rocky areas where they could establish overlapping fields of fire and make any assault extremely costly for the attackers. There, he pointed to a cluster of large boulders about 200 meters ahead. "Natural fortress, multiple escape routes if we need them." They reached the position just as the first enemy scouts appeared on the ridgeline behind them. Sarah immediately began setting up a defensive shooting position while Rodriguez called their base with an updated situation report and requested immediate air support. The first contact came 20 minutes later when an enemy fighter appeared in Sarah's scope at a range of about 600 meters. The man was moving carefully from cover to cover, obviously aware that he was hunting a skilled sniper who had already demonstrated deadly accuracy at long range. Sarah waited until he exposed himself while moving between rocks, then fired a single shot that dropped him instantly. The psychological effect on his companions was obvious. The advance stopped immediately as the other fighters sought cover and tried to locate her position. "One down," she reported to Rodriguez. "But they'll probably try to flank us now." The battle that followed tested every skill Sarah had developed during her months of combat operations. Enemy fighters approached their position from multiple directions, using the terrain expertly to minimize their exposure to her rifle fire. She had to constantly shift her attention between different threat sectors, engaging targets as they appeared while conserving ammunition for the extended fight she knew was coming. Rodriguez proved invaluable as both spotter and additional firepower, using his M4 carbine to engage closer threats while helping Sarah track targets at longer ranges. His experience as a combat veteran showed as he managed their defensive position and coordinated their responses to enemy attacks. The fighting continued for over an hour, with Sarah accounting for at least 12 enemy casualties while Rodriguez eliminated several more. But their ammunition was running low, and the enemy was becoming more aggressive as they realized the two Americans were isolated and unsupported. "Where's our air support?" Sarah asked during a brief lull in the fighting. Rodriguez was on the radio immediately, demanding an update from their controller. The response was not encouraging. "Aircraft are inbound but still 30 minutes out. Can you hold your position?" Looking at their dwindling ammunition supply and the increasing boldness of the enemy attacks, Sarah knew that 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. They needed to do something dramatic to change the tactical situation, or they would be overrun before help arrived. That's when she spotted the opportunity that would make her famous throughout the American military and earn her a place in the legends told by soldiers for years to come. Through her scope, she could see what appeared to be a senior enemy commander positioning his men for a final assault on their defensive position. The man was standing in the open, obviously confident that he was beyond effective rifle range at nearly 1,200 meters. He was directing his fighters with hand signals and pointing toward the boulder cluster where Sarah and Rodriguez were making their stand. Taking him out would demoralize his men and possibly cause them to break off their attack. It would be the longest shot Sarah had ever attempted under combat conditions, requiring perfect calculation of wind speed, temperature, and bullet trajectory. But, as enemy fighters began massing for what would clearly be their final assault, she knew she had to try. "Extreme range target," she told Rodriguez as she began making the complex calculations required for such a shot. "This is going to be all or nothing." #under fire story part for the mathematics of an 1100-meter shot in mountain terrain are unforgiving. Sarah Chen lay behind her rifle, calculating variables that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few minutes. Wind speed at her position was different from wind speed at the target, and both were different from wind speed along the bullet's path. Temperature affected powder burn rate, which affected muzzle velocity. The target was at a different elevation, requiring compensation for the ballistic trajectory. Through her scope, she watched the enemy commander continuing to position his men for what would obviously be a coordinated assault on her position. The man moved with confidence, clearly believing he was well beyond the range of any rifle. Sarah counted at least 40 fighters now visible in various positions around their defensive site, with probably more hidden behind cover. "Range 1,200 meters, Rodriguez announced quietly, having confirmed the distance with his laser rangefinder. "Wind is variable, maybe 8 to 12 knots from the southwest. Temperature dropping as the sun gets lower." Sarah had one shot. If she missed, the enemy commander would immediately move to cover and direct his assault from a concealed position. If she hit, there was a chance, not a guarantee, but a chance, that his death might cause enough confusion to delay the attack until air support arrived. She settled into her shooting position with the deliberate precision that had become second nature during her months of combat operations. The M24 felt solid and familiar against her shoulder, its weight distributed perfectly by the bipod legs she had adjusted for the exact angle required. Her breathing slowed as she entered the focused mental state that blocked out everything except the target in her crosshairs. The enemy commander paused in his movements, standing fully upright as he pointed toward a group of fighters positioned on their left flank. It was the opportunity Sarah needed, a stationary target presenting the largest possible silhouette. She began her shooting sequence. Deep breath. Exhale halfway. Find the natural respiratory pause. Crosshairs steady on target. Begin trigger pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with the familiar recoil of the match-grade .308 cartridge. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's flight path across the mountain valley, a journey that would take nearly 2 seconds at that extreme range. Time seemed suspended as she waited to see the results of the most important shot of her career. The enemy commander suddenly staggered and fell backward, his body crumpling to the rocky ground as the bullet struck him center mass. Around him, his fighters looked around in confusion, trying to understand how their leader had been killed at such an impossible distance. Target down, Sarah reported, already working the bolt action to chamber a fresh round in case follow-up shots were needed. The psychological impact on the enemy fighters was immediate and dramatic. Without their commander's steady direction, the coordinated assault dissolved into confusion and argument. Some fighters wanted to continue the attack, while others seemed to lose their enthusiasm for pressing forward against a sniper who had just demonstrated the ability to kill at ranges they had thought impossible. "They're backing off," Rodriguez observed through his spotting scope. "Looks like your shot broke their momentum." But Sarah knew they weren't safe yet. Leaderless groups of fighters could be unpredictable, and there were still too many of them for her and Rodriguez to handle if they decided to rush their positions simultaneously. She continued scanning for targets while listening for the sound of approaching aircraft. The reprieve lasted for 20 minutes before the enemy fighters reorganized under new leadership and resumed their assault. This time they approached more cautiously, having learned to respect the range and accuracy of Sarah's rifle. They moved in small groups using available cover, making themselves more difficult targets while gradually closing the distance to her defensive position. Sarah engaged them methodically, taking careful shots at any fighter who exposed himself enough to present a clear target. Her ammunition was running dangerously low. She had fired over 30 rounds during the extended engagement, leaving her with fewer than 20 cartridges remaining. Each shot now had to count not just tactically, but practically. "Aircraft inbound," Rodriguez announced after monitoring their radio communications. "2 Apache gunships, ETA 5 minutes. The sound reached them before they could see the helicopters, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades echoing off the mountain walls. Sarah felt a surge of relief as she spotted the first gunship appearing around a distant ridge, its weapon systems already oriented toward the battlefield below. The Apache helicopter pilots had been briefed on the tactical situation during their flight to the area. They could see the enemy fighters positioned around Sarah and Rodriguez's defensive position, and they had clear rules of engagement for any armed individuals threatening American forces. The first rocket strike hit a group of fighters who had been preparing to assault from the north. The explosion sent bodies flying and immediately scattered the survivors as they realized their situation had changed dramatically. The second Apache engaged targets on the eastern approach, its 30mm chain gun cutting down several fighters who had been caught in the open. Within minutes, the entire tactical situation was reversed. Enemy fighters who had been confidently preparing to overrun Sarah's position were now fleeing for their lives as the heavily armed helicopters dominated the battlefield. Those who couldn't find adequate cover were quickly eliminated by the precision fire from above. "Overwatch, this is Guardian Flight," came the voice of the lead Apache pilot. "We have visual on your position and are engaging all hostile forces in your vicinity. Prepare for extraction, dust off is 5 minutes behind us." The medical evacuation helicopter appeared just as the Apache gunships finished clearing the immediate area of enemy fighters. Sarah and Rodriguez gathered their equipment and moved quickly to the landing zone the pilots had designated, a relatively flat area about 200 meters from their defensive position. As the Black Hawk settled onto the rocky ground, Sarah took one last look at the battlefield where she had just fought for her life. The mountainous terrain was scattered with the bodies of enemy fighters who had underestimated both her skills and the determination of American forces to protect their own. The successful mission had eliminated multiple high-value targets and disrupted what intelligence would later determine was a major planning meeting for attacks against coalition forces. The flight back to Forward Operating Base Sentinel gave Sarah time to process what had just happened. She had successfully completed one of the most dangerous missions in her career, eliminating confirmed high-value targets while surviving a sustained assault by vastly superior numbers of enemy fighters. The 1100-meter shot that killed the enemy commander would become the stuff of military legend, but Sarah was more focused on the broader implications of the mission's success. Colonel Mitchell was waiting on the landing pad when their helicopter touched down. His expression showed both relief and professional satisfaction as Sarah and Rodriguez climbed out of the aircraft and reported to him immediately. "Outstanding work," Mitchell said simply. "Both of you. Intelligence preliminary assessment indicates you eliminated at least 6 high-priority targets during the meeting engagement, plus an estimated 20 additional enemy fighters during your withdrawal and defense." The debriefing took place immediately in the secure conference room where Sarah had received her initial mission briefing 3 days earlier. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about the targets she had engaged, their behavior and equipment, and any information that might be useful for future operations. The primary target, Taliban commander Qadir Rahman, was confirmed killed by your first shot, the senior intelligence officer reported. He was responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout this province. His death will significantly disrupt enemy operations. Sarah learned that the meeting she had observed and disrupted was far more significant than she had been told during her initial briefing. Intelligence analysts had been tracking communications about this gathering for weeks, understanding that it represented a major coordination effort between Taliban leadership and foreign advisors, probably from Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. "Your actions today probably prevented several major attacks that were being planned for the coming months," the intelligence officer continued. "The coordination and planning capability you disrupted would have taken them months to rebuild, if they can rebuild it at all. But the mission's success came with unexpected consequences." Word of Sarah's performance spread quickly through military channels, reaching senior commanders throughout the theater of operations. Within days, requests for her services began arriving from units across Afghanistan, each one describing missions that required precision shooting under extreme conditions. General Patricia Hayes, the theater commander responsible for all special operations in Afghanistan, personally requested a meeting with Sarah less than a week after her return from the mountain mission. Hayes was a career military officer who had risen through the ranks during some of the most challenging periods in American military history, and her reputation for operational excellence was legendary. "Captain Chen," Hayes began as they met in her private office at Bugram Airfield, "your recent performance has attracted attention at the highest levels of command. I'm here to discuss opportunities that could significantly expand your impact on operations throughout this region." The opportunities Hayes described were both exciting and daunting. Sarah would be assigned to a special task force that conducted the most sensitive and dangerous missions in the theater. She would work directly with intelligence agencies and special operations units, targeting individuals whose deaths or capture could alter the entire strategic situation in Afghanistan. "This is not a decision to make lightly," Hayes warned. "The missions you would undertake would be far more dangerous than anything you've experienced so far. The enemy would specifically target you if they learned your identity. Your life would be at constant risk." Sarah asked for time to consider the offer, understanding that accepting would fundamentally change both her military career and her personal life. She would be operating at the absolute cutting edge of combat operations, dealing with threats and responsibilities that few soldiers ever faced. That evening, she walked the perimeter of Forward Operating Base Sentinel one final time, thinking about how much her life had changed since arriving in Afghanistan. The uncertain young officer who had struggled to gain acceptance from her peers had evolved into one of the most effective combat snipers in the American military. Her skills had been tested repeatedly under the most extreme conditions, and she had never failed to meet the challenge. Captain David Walsh found her near the eastern watchtower, looking out at the mountains where she had fought for her life just days earlier. His expression showed both pride in her accomplishments and concern for the psychological toll that constant combat operations might be taking. "Heard about General Hayes' offer," he said, settling beside her on a wooden bench that someone had built overlooking the base's outer perimeter. "Quite an opportunity. Also quite a responsibility," Sarah replied. The mission she's describing would put me in situations where failure isn't just professional disappointment, it's death. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. You've already proven you can handle that kind of pressure. The question is whether you want to make it your full-time life. Their conversation continued for over an hour, covering not just the tactical aspects of the mission Sarah would undertake, but the personal cost of a career built around lethal precision. Walsh had counseled many combat veterans over the years, and he understood better than most how the accumulated stress of life and death decisions could affect even the most psychologically resilient soldiers. Whatever you decide, Walsh concluded, remember that you've already accomplished more in 6 months than most soldiers accomplish in entire careers. You don't have anything left to prove to anyone. But Sarah knew that proving herself to others had never been the real motivation. From the beginning, her drive had come from an internal desire to excel, to push the boundaries of what was possible, and to make a meaningful contribution to missions that mattered. The offer from General Hayes represented the ultimate opportunity to apply her skills in service of objectives that could affect the outcome of the entire conflict. The next morning, Sarah reported to Colonel Mitchell's office with her decision. He looked up from the stack of reports he was reviewing as she entered, and she could see in his expression that he already knew what she was going to tell him. You're taking the assignment with General Hayes, he said without waiting for her to speak. Yes, sir. I am. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. I can't say I'm surprised. This base has been a stepping stone for you from the beginning. You were always destined for bigger things. The transfer orders were cut within hours, and Sarah found herself preparing to leave Forward Operating Base Sentinel after only 6 months of deployment. But those 6 months had fundamentally changed her, transforming her from a promising young officer into one of the most capable combat snipers in the American military. Rodriguez found her packing her equipment that afternoon, his expression showing mixed emotions about her departure. They had become an effective team during their months of working together, and he understood better than anyone how her skills had developed under combat conditions. Going to miss having the best shot in the battalion watching my back, he said as he helped her secure her rifle case. Whoever they assign as your new spotter is going to have big shoes to fill. You taught me half of what I know about combat operations, Sarah replied. Everything from reading terrain to understanding enemy tactics. I wouldn't be ready for this new assignment without the foundation you helped me build. As her helicopter lifted off from Forward Operating Base Sentinel the next morning, Sarah looked down at the compound that had been her home during the most formative months of her military career. The base looked small and isolated from the air, a tiny outpost of American power in a vast and hostile landscape. But she knew that her real education was just beginning. The missions that awaited her with General Hayes' task force would test her skills and judgment in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The stakes would be higher, the risks greater, and the margin for error smaller than anything she had experienced so far. As the helicopter turned northeast toward Bagram Airfield and her new assignment, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Every shot she had fired, every mission she had completed, and every challenge she had overcome had been preparation for what lay ahead. The war was far from over, and the most difficult tests of her abilities were still to come.